and honored to have you join us today with a very timely and interesting topic ahead of us. Before we begin, please welcome Ambassador Jo Hee-young for the opening remarks and to introduce our speaker today.
Good evening, Mr. John Wicks and Excellencies and the members of Parliament and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for being here as we open the second the season of Embassy Speaker Series. First, I'd like to deliver my deep thanks to each of you for your continued interest in Korea and for your full support for the advancement of bilateral relations between our two countries. During the last year, we have launched this Embassy Speaker Series as we celebrate, as we mark the 50th anniversary of different ties and 60th anniversary of Korean War armistice. Through the course of the year 2013, Embassy Speaker Series gave us a good opportunity to learn from and exchange views with the Canadian thinker and policymakers on bilateral relations between Korea and Canada, from Korean War to economic cooperation and cultural exchanges, and to strategic collaboration in the international community. It was a very good opportunity to look back our relations in the past and to garner some kind of wisdom to set up some guideline with which we'll be heading for the next 50 years. And it was very, very helpful for both of us to enhance the mutual understanding between our two peoples and encourage the greater appreciation for our shared the past, the present, and the future. And of course, we've gotten some ideas and some inspiration about how to further advance the bilateral relations in the days to come. So, like last year, we'd like to continue this program with the goal for exploring the new avenue for cooperation between our two peoples. So as we all agree, the two countries, Korea and Canada, have developed a very special partnership based upon common values and robust economic ties and close people-to-people connections. And we have achieved the continuously successes together as the staunch allies and the ideal partners and like-minded countries. So, generally speaking, that we have enjoyed very excellent bilateral relations for more than 6 decades. But in spite of this reality and facts, that we two people have long recognized that there is still untapped potential for our mutual benefits. So in that regard, our two governments in recent years, recognizing the importance of the free trade agreement between our two countries to raise the current partnership to a new level, have set the trade negotiation a top priority. Since I assumed my duty in July 2012, the free trade agreement has been my top priority. And thanks to the strong commitment of our leaders, and thanks to hard work of our negotiators, and more importantly, the generous support from the public, we could get some tangible progress during the last year. So finally, in March, when the Prime Minister Harper made an official visit to Korea, our two leaders, the Madam President Park Geun-hye and Prime Minister Harper, declared the final conclusion of negotiation on free trade agreement. Well, I'm so relieved to witness the final end of negotiation on free trade agreement. And to quote our two leaders, this historic deal will unlock the full potential of our economic relations. Of course, the potential effect of the free trade agreement extend far beyond the economic relevance. So it will upgrade our bilateral relations in all sectors of the common interests, and also lay the firm foundation for the new era of mutually beneficial political, economic, cultural, and people-to-people relations. And personally, I'm sure the free trade agreement between our two countries will have the most profound impact on our relations and define how it expands in the next couple of decades. So today, given the great historic step forward in our bilateral relations, I think it is very timely and very fitting that we start the ambassador's negotiations with the discussion on the Korea-Canada Free Trade Agreement. We are honored to have Mr. John Wicks as a guest speaker to share his unique perspective on the free trade agreement between our two countries, as well as his expertise in international trade and his insights for the challenges and opportunities for our two countries. Mr. Wicks has spent over 40 years in the fields of international trade, international relations, and foreign economic policy and trade negotiations. Mr. Wicks have long served people and government of Canada in numerous positions, including the Assistant Deputy Minister at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He also represented Canada in various trade negotiations at international meetings. Most notably, Mr. Wicks served as Canada's chief negotiator for the North American Free Trade Agreement, as chair of the WTO General Council, and Canada's ambassador to the WTO and to the GATT during the historic Uruguay rounds. With responsibility for managing Canada's relations with the United States and the implementation of NAFTA, Mr. Wicks provided strategic visions to companies on how to take maximum advantage of the opportunities that NAFTA afforded. Well, with this in mind, I'm sure we will all learn a great deal from his presentation. Mr. Wicks, thank you again for your presence here tonight, and welcome to the stand.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Cho, for that very kind introduction. Ambassador Cho, Mrs. Cho, Your Excellencies, Members of Parliament, distinguished guests. It's a pleasure for me to be here this evening to talk to you about the subject which has just been so ably introduced by the Ambassador. I must say, too, when I came in this morning, this evening, I realized I was in the right place. Although for a moment I thought I was looking at a mirror. As you already heard, of course, on March 11, Prime Minister Harper and President Park announced the conclusion of the negotiation of a free trade agreement between our two countries. And I think it's very important to give credit to the two leaders for the leadership they provided to bring this historic agreement to a successful conclusion. And clearly the ministers on both sides and their teams of officials also deserve a lot of credit for making this happen. And of course, thank you. I'm being well looked after. And of course, Ambassador Joe, thank you also for your efforts at trying to get these talks that were still somewhat moribund when you arrived into their final and decisive phase. This agreement, it's been said, is important. It's the first agreement that Canada has with an Asian country, and I think it quite clearly is a major milestone in the Harper government's free trade agenda. Now, this agreement, of course, it's a modern trade agreement. It's got all those elements that we see in other modern trade agreements. It's been designed in particular with the context of Canada-Korean relations in mind, and I think that's very important. I'll say some more about that as I go on. And I'm going to say a little bit about the environment within which trade is now conducted and negotiators now operate, because I think that's important to take some of those factors into account as we assess the potential of this bilateral trade agreement. So what are some of these factors? And I'm going to mention 4 things that I will talk about, and then I'll go in more depth to talk about them. The first factor I think that we should really think about is the challenge posed for international companies operating in a world of competitive trade liberalization. And I'll get in a few minutes to what I mean by competitive trade liberalization. The second set of factors is I think we need to recognize that free trade agreements don't automatically deliver access to consumers. That marketing is essential, and frankly, more and more, understanding the thinking of the consumer is critical in being able to make sure that you take advantage of a free trade agreement. Another thing I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about is the significance of the fact that Canada and Korea have complementary economies and are both deeply engaged in global supply chains. And finally, I'll turn to the agreement. Although I'm not going to try to provide an exhaustive description of the agreement, I think that's been very well done elsewhere and in a lot of publications that have come out. But I do want to say something about how I think the provisions of the agreement can operate in combination to help further the economic relationship between Canada and Korea and deliver some of that promise that the Ambassador was referring to. So first of all, to talk about the challenge posed to international companies by this environment of competitive trade liberalization. And I think that this indeed is one of the biggest challenges for any globally active firm in 2014, is trying to keep track of how rapidly changing barriers to market access and international trade rules are going to impact on its operations. Let's take the example of the agreement we're talking about this evening. This agreement, of course, was concluded earlier this year. We hope it will come into force by January 1 of next year. And And that's all well and good. However, the United States beat us to the punch. They negotiated earlier than we did an agreement with Korea, and that agreement came into force on January 1st, 2012. And it was at that point that the first set of tariff concessions were made, the first cut in tariffs to implement the agreement. There have since that time been 2 more sets of cuts in the phasing in of that trade agreement, which creates a situation where Canadian producers of a number of products are now a number of percentage points, depending on the height of the duty, behind the United States. And this is particularly significant in product areas like beef and pork, where the Korean tariff was in the original tariff in the order of 40%, the so-called most favored nation tariff. And it's being cut down so that we're now some 8 percentage points in a number of these areas behind. And of course, the 4th cut in tariffs under the Korean agreement with the United States will take place next January 1st. This is why it's very important that we try to make sure that this agreement is implemented by that time so that we don't suffer any further negative effects of this increasing wall of discrimination. Another thing that is important to take into account is the fact that these 2 agreements aren't identical. So even when they're phased in, businesses are going to have to think about, which country is it most advantageous to think about centering the business in if you're going to be shipping things to Korea. And of course, it's not just in the Canada-Korea context that this is an issue. To give a different geographic example of the European Union, Canada, and the United States, the situation there could well play out in Canada's favor because, as most people in this room, I'm sure, are aware, Canada and the European Union have reached an agreement in principle on a comprehensive economic and trade agreement, and the United States and Canada and the European Union are hopeful that in the coming months that agreement will be completed and the process of implementation will begin. In the case of the United States and the European Union, they're at a much earlier stage of the negotiation of a similar bilateral trade agreement. And I think that it's quite likely that, and I hope, that Canada crosses this finish line first. And it could well be that Canada would enjoy 2 or more years of preferential access to the European market, similar to what the United States is doing to Canada and Korea, and before the United States agreement was completed and they began to catch up. Now this, of course, creates a lot of considerations. Once again, companies are going to have to think, if they're shipping to Europe from North America, is it better to have production of a particular product situated in the United States or in Canada in terms of the efficiency of being able to deliver that product effectively to consumers in Europe? And one could go on, of course, picking other examples of describing how complicated the world has become. Now, it wasn't always this complicated. Until 20 years ago, basically, almost all of the trade liberalization and the associated reduction in non-tariff barriers was situated in Geneva, all those negotiations, in the GATT, and then which was the predecessor of the World Trade Organization, the WTO. And interestingly, even when liberalization was done on a unilateral basis, countries, of course, still had to respect the most favored nation principle, the MFN principle, which required that they have identical tariffs for all other countries that were members of the GATT and then of the WTO. So essentially, it didn't matter which country you were operating in, shipping to another country, you'd face basically the same barriers that other countries did in shipping to that market. So it was quite a straightforward, ordered universe. The situation is now dramatically different. We've entered this world of what has been called competitive trade liberalization. And in this new environment, countries are competing with each other to see who can be the first to get access, or free access, or at least preferential access, to the markets of partner countries. And of course, the country that gets across the finish line first guarantees its producers a period of time during which they will have an advantage over their competitors in countries with which they normally be competing. And there's a tendency, as the agreement is phased in, for this preferential advantage even to increase over time. And it would probably remain in effect until the other country negotiates a similar agreement and catches up, or until there's a broader regional partnership that involves all those countries in a similar type of agreement, or until there's a multilateral negotiation that moves that ball forward again. Now, clearly, companies need to spend a lot of time in this environment of competitive trade liberalization, thinking about how they're going to deliver goods efficiently to customers. And in this increasingly variable geometry in international trade rules and barriers, there's really a requirement to do a lot of analysis and due diligence. I think you can make a strong case for doing a trade audit in any business where you're considering advancing a new product line, or reconsidering your situation in the world, or planning a new investment. That the nature of the barriers out there in the market in which you're operating for particular products definitely require study to a much greater extent than they did in the not too distant past. Now, I could also make a reference to the fact, of course, that Korea has now completed an agreement with Australia and signed it, and the text has been released, but it has not enforced yet. But this is another reason why I would urge my Canadian friends and my Korean colleagues to move as quickly as possible to bringing the Canadian agreement into force, because I think it would be desirable to keep the playing field as level as possible. Now, I've offered a few glimpses, really, into these challenges that competitive trade liberalization presents. And I think for the foreseeable future, this is the kind of world in which we're going to be living. We're going to see the negotiation of more and more of these bilateral agreements. We're also seeing the negotiation of what has been called mega regional agreements, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPP, like the agreement between Europe and the United States, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP. I made a speech in Washington about a year ago, and I talked about TTIP, and nobody knew what I was talking about, but I think that's changed a bit now. And then, of course, to cite one other, and there are a lot of others, but I'll pick one that Canada is not in and Korea is, and that's the RCEP, the Regional and Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which involves 10 ASEAN countries, China, Japan, Korea, and Australia and New Zealand, and India. So, that may be a difficult one to negotiate. They're all quite difficult to negotiate, actually. But that would be quite an agreement if it were to come to pass. Let me now turn to the consumer. Increasingly, I think what the consumer wants drives everything. And for businesses, the consumers' wishes are increasingly becoming the new imperative. And frankly, the consumer wants quite a bit. Now, these new consumer requirements, and I use that in a term not in a legal sense, but in terms of what the consumer is insisting on, are of course reflected in the marketplace. But increasingly, they're also reflected in safety and quality standards that are set by governments, and also ones that are set by corporations or within supply chains. And what we see here is governments are trying to assure consumers that they have their interests at heart. Businesses are trying to reassure consumers that they get it, what they're interested in. And I suppose it's true that nowhere are these pressures stronger than in the food sector. And of course, also companies have their own assurances and claims they're making in the marketplace, and those also are part of the landscape. A colleague of mine on the board of the Alberta Livestock and Meat Agency, Jeff Kroll, is the Senior Vice President of National Supply Chains for McDonald's Restaurants of Canada. And McDonald's is the largest buyer of ground beef in the food service sector in Canada. They purchase annually 67 million pounds of Canadian beef. And by the way, all the beef they use is Canadian. Now, Jeff made the point in a recent article, and I'm going to quote this, because I think it's very interesting, the perception of a big company like that about the role of the consumer. People truly want to know what is in their food, who produced it, where it came from, and how it's made. People read the nutrition labels these days, and they want to know as much as possible. Now, obviously, it's not only consumers in Canada that are concerned about quality and safety and other factors. Korean consumers are very discerning, and Canadian producers are going to need to learn how these potential customers think if they want to take full advantage of this trade agreement. Now, I will add that there's also a risk, of course, that sometimes barriers can be erected in the name of some of these objectives without justification, really more with a desire to protect a domestic industry than to provide a particular benefit to consumers. And clearly, all good trade agreements, as I think this one does, need to guard against that risk. But there's another implication that these developments are having, and that's on traceability systems. In fact, traceability systems are really becoming essential to meet these regulatory and marketing objectives. There's a premium put by these new consumer demands on being able to trace the food product back to its origin. Now, in the food business, this is done through various traceability programs. 10 years ago or so, traceability programs were there basically to police health and safety issues. But the situation has changed so that these systems are now used also under regulatory and sanitary headings of trade agreements. And of course, companies need to have be able to, in order to demonstrate that their claims about their products are justified and based in fact, need to be able to maintain a system of being able to trace the product back to its origin so that they can substantiate these claims. And in trade agreements, of course, it's often necessary to be able to demonstrate, in order to qualify for entry under the agreement, that a particular product does not contain certain substances, or even just that it is a so-called product of origin of the country from which it's coming, which determines whether or not that product will actually qualify for the treatment under the free trade agreement. Now, I'd like to turn to the issue of Canada and Korea. I think we're both important and complementary partners. Don't be intimidated by this yet. I'll get to it in a minute. But I decided that I couldn't possibly explain that. I'd have to put it up. So that now, the rapid development of global supply chains has had an important impact on the nature of world trade. No longer is a good simply produced in one country and shipped to another. Developments in technology and transportation can dramatically change the way in which international trade takes place. Much of international trade is now an exchange of tasks among firms in different countries collaborating in the production of finished products. And both Canada and Korea are quite heavily involved in this new way of organizing production. Now, I've turned to, having had some WTO experience, I find I'm always turning to WTO statistics to find information. So I turned to the WTO to the 2012 edition of World Trade Developments, which really sets out a series of statistical summaries on world trade, because I thought I might get some things there that would be useful in terms of thinking about the Canada-Korea Free Trade Agreement. Now, Canada and Korea are both leading traders. And if we count the EU as one entity, Korea is the 5th largest world exporter of merchandise goods by value and the 6th largest importer. Canada is in 8th place for exports and imports. So we're both up there in the top 10. As for commercial services, Korea is the world's 8th largest exporter and 7th largest importer, while Canada is in 10th place for exports and 8th place for imports. In bilateral terms, Korea is Canada's 6th largest export market and 6th largest supplier. So only the United States, China, the EU, Japan, and Mexico have more trade with Canada than does Korea. Now, the WTO also has statistics that help demonstrate how countries are engaged in global value chains. The WTO statistics for leading exporters and importers of intermediate goods, goods that are then factored into another stage of production, really part of this exchange of tasks I was talking about. So these statistics for leading exporters and importers of intermediate goods in 2011 show that both Canada and Korea are actively engaged in this type of business. On the export side, Korea and Canada rank 5th and 9th among leading global suppliers of intermediate goods, and on the import side, 6th and 9th. So very active. Now, another set of WTO statistics shows shares of domestic and foreign sectoral contributions in gross exports for selected economies for the year 2008. Now, unfortunately, 2008 is the last year for which the statistics are available. While these statistics can be very revealing and ones that show the value added that's put in, they're a lot harder to produce. So they can't just be simply collected at the border by customs officials and then published. So it takes a while to look at this, but I thought this actually is quite instructive. So let me take a moment to explain it. So this, I've taken all the other countries out and just used Canada and Korea. But this shows, these are percentages of total exports. So this is over here 100% of the exports. This describes in the components 100% of the exports of Canada and Korea. Now, obviously, because we're both engaged in a lot of trade in intermediate goods. This is the domestic component of those exports, and this is the foreign component of these exports. So these are products that are exported in and then re-exported. Now, obviously, these are global figures rather than figures that are just focused on a particular product. So, but I think nonetheless it's quite instructive. First of all, it's not surprising that Canada is, in its exports, has a larger domestic content of percentage content of primary products than does Korea. That's not surprising. But I think what people might find surprising is that in the case of Canada, that actually both manufacturers and services in 2008, I don't know what the current, account for a larger proportion of Canadian exports than primary products. Obviously with Korea, the largest figure is 34.4% domestic percentage of manufacturers. So this is primary products, manufacturers, services. Now over here, this is the foreign inputs. And as you can see, Korea has quite large foreign inputs on all of these sectors, including primary products, where 15% of the exports are primary products, and manufacturers 14.2, and services 13.4. Well, looking at Canada here, very successful in services, and obviously significant in primary products, and also quite important in terms of exports in the manufacturer sector. To me, this suggests that there's a lot of potential for being able to realize opportunities as between Canada and Korea. And obviously you can't base a specific company planning on global statistics like that, but I think there's enough suggested by those statistics that it's worth spending more effort on investigating these possibilities more deeply. Now, of course, you can say that Korea is deeply involved in supply chains in East Asia, and Canada is deeply involved in supply chains in North America. But I think, so people can pour a bit of cold water on the potential, but I think actually the conclusion of a free trade agreement is a time to be thinking of potential and thinking ambitiously, as the ambassador was doing in his introduction. When I had completed the negotiations on the North American Free Trade Agreement, a lot of people wanted to know, well, what did I think was the most important impact of the NAFTA? What was the most important thing we did in the NAFTA? And I said that I thought it was that the most important impact was the psychological impact. That basically it changed the way people thought about their relationship with their domestic market, with their international markets, and opened up a new period of entrepreneurship and rising to the challenge. And I hope that as a result of this agreement that the private sectors in both our countries will be bold enough to take a similar approach, because I think there could be a lot of very significant potential out there. Now, Canada and Korea, as we discussed, are both top 10 players in the World Trade League. This is a globally significant agreement. It's a very important bilateral agreement, but it's globally significant too, given our status. And this goes a long way, I think, to laying the foundation for a more promising partnership between two G20 countries. Now, I said I would turn and talk briefly about the agreement itself. And I would welcome, to the extent that time permits, some interaction with the audience afterwards too, because I was thinking I would set out a number of things that some of which might surprise people, some of which might bore people, some of which might be mildly contentious, and then there might be some reaction from the audience that would get us into a different level of discussion. So I'm not going to provide or attempt to provide an exhaustive description. In fact, I think the documents put out by the Canadian government provide a very good summary description of what is in the agreement. In addition, we need to remember that although the negotiations have been concluded, the final text has not yet been made public, and I assume that the legal scrubbing of that text and the translation of that text are now well underway, and we will see the final, the exact versions in due course. But I think that from what we know and what I've discussed with people, the agreement seems well designed to take advantage of the Canada-Korea relationship. It's a modern trade agreement, takes into account the changing nature of international trade, and offers a solid legal framework for a 21st century trade relationship. In many ways, it's similar to NAFTA, but has been updated to take account of improvements that have been negotiated since the NAFTA was concluded. I also think it's very important to look at the agreement as a whole and consider the interaction of the different provisions of the agreement rather than just focus on specific parts of the agreement dealing with particular products. Now, the technical summary of final negotiated outcomes released by the Canadian government on March 11 categorizes the outcomes in 7 sections. And I'll just read the titles out because I think it's interesting. Non-agricultural goods, which is a terrible term that seems to have grown into common use now, that we classify everything except agriculture as non-agricultural. It really mostly means manufacturers. Industrial products. Agriculture and food products is the second heading. The third heading is services and investment, which I'll come back to in a minute. Government procurement. Fifth is intellectual property. Sixth, dispute resolution and institutional provisions. And seventh is environment and labor. So for those people who think that a free trade agreement is largely about elimination of tariffs, I think just those headings should put you quite quickly in the know that you didn't have it quite right. Of course, tariff elimination remains a very important part of a free trade agreement and is a large part of what the first 2 headings that I mentioned a moment ago are about. The non-agricultural sector and the agricultural sector. And I think it's very impressive to see the extent to which the 2 countries have committed to duty elimination, some of it in sensitive product areas over a considerable period of time. But this is an agreement that will provide real free trade when we get to the point where it's fully implemented. Some of those implementations I think will take up to, I forget whether it's 14 or 15 years, something like that. But most of it will happen much more quickly than that. And if our experience with the free trade agreement with the United States and NAFTA is anything to go by, frankly, once you start implementing it and people know that that's what's happening, a lot of the potential is often realized more quickly than one might expect. Now I'm going to address a subject that isn't mentioned in those headings, but is very important. And that is important in both the industrial goods area and the agricultural and food product area, are the disciplines dealing with product and safety standards and sanitary and phytosanitary regulations. Now, in this area, the Canada-Korea Free Trade Agreement reaffirms the disciplines established in the World Trade Organization, but it also goes on to address particular issues in the Canada-Korea context, including in regard to wood building products, automotive products, and a range of agricultural products, among others. Institutionally, the agreement creates provisions that create committees under which problems that arise can be discussed. Transparency provisions will help to make sure that that there's discussion before new regulations are put in place that might have adverse effect on trade. And effective dispute resolution provisions are also available. Now, I said I would come back to services and investment. And I think these provisions can be particularly important in encouraging various new forms of partnership between private sector interests in both countries. It's very instructive to see the increasing role of trade and services in global supply chains. And of course, the investment provisions provide rules about the treatment of investments that I think would encourage countries, private sector interests in both Korea and Canada to be more confident about undertaking joint ventures and various partnerships in knowing that they're doing that within a legal framework that has been sanctioned by the two governments and put into the laws of the two countries. Indeed, I think we may find that one of the most significant opportunities that comes out of this agreement is the opportunity for Canadian and Korean partners to look at forming partnerships and joint ventures for exploiting opportunities in third countries. The most favored nation clause present in this agreement is also important because it guarantees that in any subsequent agreements that Canada or Korea negotiates, that the other partner will benefit from the improved treatment, say, in the investment area or the services area that's extended to that country. So clearly, there are a lot of opportunities here that will, I believe, emerge from this agreement. It's important, as we've already noted, to bring this agreement into force so that both businesses and consumers can start to benefit from it in a practical way. And I think with the continued good effort that is already underway on both sides, there's no reason why the implementation procedures can't be completed expeditiously and why the agreement can't come into force by January 1 of 2015. And of course, once the text of the agreement is released, and once its ratification is assured, then the private sector can really begin to plan in earnest about how to profit from the new opportunities that are opened up. And I think hopefully in the coming years we will see a new reinvigorated, flourishing Canada-Korea economic relationship coming out of this agreement. And I would also express the hope, as the ambassador said, that this positive effect won't be limited to the economic area, but will spread into other aspects of our relationship. So I will end my remarks there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weeks, for sharing with us your insights and perspectives. Now we will take some questions for our speaker today. If you have any questions, please raise your hand, and we will provide a mic to you. We have a first question over there. If you can please introduce yourself to the speaker as well, that'd be great.
Hi, my name is Cesar Remy from the Mexican Embassy. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Do you believe, Mr. Weeks, that it makes sense for Korea to enter the TPP negotiation? And if so, I mean, do you think Korea shares some similar motivation like Canada and Mexico to enter the TPP negotiation? And what would those be?
Well, thank you very much. I don't think there's I have to be very cautious about trying to comment on what the Koreans are thinking. You should ask that question of the ambassador. But of course, Korea has indicated that it is would like to join in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, I think that and indeed there are a number of other countries which are expressing interest in doing that as well. And I think there's a feeling out there that in this world of competitive trade liberalization, that if you don't want to be in a situation where you're cutting yourself off from some important opportunities in business and access to markets. And nobody can forecast exactly, even among those countries with which you already have free trade agreements, exactly what the impact of superimposing on that the Trans-Pacific Partnership will be. In fact, that can be the subject of a whole other discussion. So I've heard, and I keep seeing reports that even China is thinking that maybe they should be at least thinking about whether they would like to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations.
Hi, my name is Barbara Rienfeld. I'm from Export Development Canada. I'm the Sector Advisor for Processed Food. Just wonder if you could comment, I see your involvement with Alberta Livestock, whether you think the opportunities for primary agriculture and for value-added on the process side are fairly balanced or really tipped perhaps towards the primary agriculture in terms of opportunities that we should be really preparing for in the next couple of years.
Well, that's a very good question, and there's been a lot of recent study done in terms of the situation, as you probably know, in the processed food industry in Canada. I think that the opportunities that are opened up by a number of these trade agreements obviously are going to be beneficial in stimulating the industry. At the same time, the industry in Canada is going to face a certain amount of competitive pressure from outside Canada. I would have thought that's particularly going to be the case with a lot of the sophisticated companies in Europe in the processed food sector. But I think that these pressures are going to be good for the competitiveness of the Canadian industry, but they need to be starting to take a proactive approach to dealing with that and moving it forward. In terms of the, when you get down to thinking about the balance between the processed and primary sectors, I was starting to think at what point in the meat sector does it? But a lot of the potential for success is going to depend too on how good Canadian exporters, producers, processors are at getting to know the consumer in the country and the market in which they're trying to make their goods sold. And I think that's something perhaps historically we haven't done well enough. We've kind of had the primary commodity thing. Oh well, that's what it is. It doesn't really matter who's our quality is very good, but these are commodities that are essentially fungible. And so how do you go about making sure that your product is something that consumers actually want, not just the people who trade in it because they make their money out of margins and so on, but the end users? How do you get to know the end users? And I think that's going to be very important going forward in making sure that Canadian suppliers of a whole range of agri-food products can prosper in this new global environment.
Okay, we'll take a question from that side.
Yeah, is that our guest here?
Thank you. Barry DeVolan, I'm a member of Parliament I've been co-chair of the Canada-Korea Interparliamentary Group for the last 8 years. So I've been through a few laps around the track a few times, and I was with the Prime Minister when he was there a couple of months ago. You spoke about, obviously, the role of the heads of state, and I agree they were key in bringing this deal together, the ministers and the staff, the diplomats. But there is another layer yet to go, which are the legislators. And the negotiations are complete, but the ratification remains. And I would anticipate that in Canada this will proceed in an orderly fashion once the paperwork is processed. And I agree with you that the goal is to have things done so that January 1st can be the start date. I anticipate that a group of Canadian legislators, including myself, will be traveling back to Korea in September or October to meet with our legislative counterparts, to the Korea-Canada group, as well as members of the committee there that will be considering their legislation. And I'm just wondering if in your experience over the years, whether you would have any advice or any observations you could share to us in terms of making that happen, possibly if there are pitfalls that you have seen in the past. I know the American Korea-Chorus deal was delayed because the American Congress was cranky. But I just wonder whether you have any advice for us in terms of how to improve our chances this fall.
Well, thank you for the question. Let me first of all commend you and the work of the committee for the positive outcome that's been achieved. I think also that this is certainly an excellent idea to be going to Korea and talking with your opposite members in the Korean Parliament. Let me take the other part of the question under advisement, because it's I off the top of my head I don't have any advice to offer you, but I'd be happy to think about that. I just think this is a very important occasion, and knowing how the Canadians often approach things in a somewhat different fashion from Americans, including when they're dealing with foreigners, I think you might do some of the things right anyway without any advice. And in a way, I suppose, on some of these difficult areas in the agreement, that the fact that the agreement between the United States and Korea is now already in force and being implemented creates a situation in which it's a little bit easier for the Korean parliamentarians to consider an agreement with Canada. After all, we're a lot smaller, and they've basically already bitten the bullet with the United States. So even though we may have additional agricultural products to sell, as will Australia, I think they've embarked on a road from which there's really no turning back at this point. So other factors start to come into play, such as not wanting to be dependent on only one supplier, and factors such as that, and I think obviously it's important to play up the potential of this agreement to work very much in the interests of both Koreans and Canadians in terms of the benefits it's going to deliver over time, and the exciting opportunities it offers to work together in an increasingly intensive fashion.
Yeah, hi, thank you, David Kilgore. Would you, being a long-time multilateral negotiator, where does GATT and WTO end up in all of this, in your view, after so much experience in that area?
Well, I think that as I was saying in my remarks, and I think the written version of what I had actually says a little bit about this, but for the foreseeable future, I think we're in the same world of this bilateral competitive trade liberalization, plus the mega regional deals. But frankly, I think we will probably see a point in the not too distant future where there's going to be some pressure to look at rationalizing all of this and an effort to consolidate these various rules in the multilaterally in the WTO. Now, I don't see this starting tomorrow, but I wouldn't be at all surprised to see this in the forefront of the agenda internationally, say 10 years from now. So and believe me, I'm quite old now, as you heard. and 10 years is not that long a time. We'll still be phasing in the Canada-Korea trade agreement. No, I definitely don't think the WTO is dead. And let me say something else too. You know, one of the things I did after I left the Canadian government, I worked in Geneva still for a number of years. And one of the clients I had was the National Foreign Trade Council, which is a trade association in the United States that's almost, well, about a century old now, which very supportive of the open multilateral system and contains a lot of big multinational companies. And they, you know, it was very interesting working with those firms because quite clearly they saw that these bilateral agreements as really being second best approaches to how to deal with the world. Of course, they're interested in it. If it breaks down barriers and opens up markets, they're good. But if you ask them, would you rather do it this way or have it all done multilaterally, they would choose the multilateral. The problem is there are more players multilaterally, it's harder to move the whole process forward as quickly. So impatience has sort of won out for the moment. But I think that as companies have experience operating in this environment of competitive trade liberalization, and not just in the negotiation of agreements, but in living in a world in which you've got all these different levels of calibration, of implementation of agreements, and even some of them written differently in terms of what they provide for, that they're going to begin to say, you know, I'd much rather have it one set of rules globally. Interestingly, I listened to the previous CEO of Cargill make a presentation a couple of years ago, in which, and unprompted by me, he said that the much preferred route for Cargill, which is the world's largest privately owned company, by the way, basically in the agriculture space, grains and meats and others, and he said they much prefer a multilateral world. That for them it was a big problem when you got a box of meat, as he put it, down on the loading dock. You know, what did this have the specifications for which country? And so it's, I just think it's a question of time.
Thank you.
Since we're pressed with time, we'll just take a couple more questions. I'll just shift over to this side where I had a hand raised earlier. Sir?
Yes, my name is Jacob Kovalio. I teach Japanese, Korean, and Chinese history and studies at Carleton University. I want to thank you very much, Ambassador Weeks, for this very comprehensive and yet to the point presentation. I would like to ask you to comment on our capability, or shall I say competitiveness, with regards to the secondary of the three economic sectors. In other words, primary and tertiary, no problem there. But about the manufacturing, what can you say, what can you comment with regards to our competitiveness in that particular field? Thank you.
Well, that's not a terribly easy question, but I think, you know, obviously we've got some challenges in the automobile sector. But I think a lot of manufacturing industries in Canada are really very competitive. I remember the Globe and Mail did quite an interesting series a couple of years ago, I guess it was now. And I think increasingly we're starting to see in this world of global supply chains, there's all kinds of niche opportunities, and it's very hard to make comments in general about whether we're competitive or not. And I must say, you know, I mean, I was surprised to look at those statistics on the component of manufacturers, domestic manufacturers in Canada's exports. That's still a quarter of our exports are in that area, and higher that year anyway than primary products. And of course the services, and there's some interesting work. I'm going to give a speech later this month somewhere else where I'm going to talk more about this, but some of the analysis been done on sort of the untold story of the development of Canada's competitive edge in tradable services is quite interesting. So in the last 20 years, it's moved from being a historic drag on our
GDP to be actually a factor increasing our GDP, which would be some $31 billion a year, our balance of payments, $31 a year less if it wasn't for the way this sector had evolved. So that's a partial answer to your question. And of course, you can't tries to sort these things out, but in the real world of production and trade, any product is probably going to have all three things wrapped up in it. So the extent to which Canada is becoming more competitive in services means that we're also going to be more competitive in manufacturers.
Okay. We have the last question there, sir.
Yes, hi. My name is Peter Rapper. I'm a consultant with the federal government. I just want to ask you very briefly about if you could just summarize some of the, underlying reciprocity and working arrangements of the free trade agreement. So, for example, looking at that chart that you have up there, the primary products are obviously, say, a huge difference between 24.2% and less than 1% with Korea. So clearly that offers possibilities and opportunities for Canada for agriculture, food products, and fresh food marketing. Traditionally, my sense of it, and that's not only Korea but elsewhere in the Pacific Rim, there's been considerable barriers to marketing that product, agricultural product for Canada. Similarly, or parallel, in manufacture, the auto sector in Korea has been a tremendous success in Canada and even in North America as a whole. Not quite the same thing can be said for the auto sector in North America and Canada. So my question is specifically, what are the underlying drivers of the free trade agreement which would possibly change the distribution to change that chart so perhaps the distribution between Canada and Korea would be much more similar than what it is, than the disparity that you've shown on the chart right now?
Well, I'd say I think that would be a bad thing. I mean, the whole point of trade is there are disparities between the way different countries' economies are organized. If everybody had exactly the same economy, you probably wouldn't need much trade. So, and obviously, I don't think any trade agreement can be done on the basis of assessing exactly what reciprocity bought what, because you're buying opportunity in a trade agreement, and opportunity is something that you have to take advantage of, and so that requires. It's not something a government can do. The government can offer an agreement as an improved framework for doing business, but then it's up to the business community to take advantage of that. Clearly, and one area where this agreement will be particularly important is in the agriculture sector, because, as you noted, the barriers are very high. And even though there's been a flourishing trade from Canada in a number of these products, that situation can be further improved and will be under this agreement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weeks, for engaging us with a very productive and informative discussion. In appreciation of your time today, we would like to present you with a commemorative plaque, a plaque of appreciation.
Thank you very much.
This is another. This is
hey.
Goodness me.
This is 217.